Hey guys, good morning and happy Monday. I'm ready to start us out on chapter 7, but before we can begin, we need to read our comprehension questions that you'll be answering in your Google Classroom after we get done reading. So I'm heading into my Google Classroom, my slide that's titled Writing Freedom Comprehension Questions. We're going down to slide number 10 and reading chapter 7. Chapter 7's questions ask, what do James and Frank tell Charlotte about the West? We don't know the names James and Frank yet, so I'm interested to see who that is. Then number 2, why is Ebenezer so attached to Charlotte? And the third question, Charlotte calls the woman she meets on the steps of the saloon brave. Why? What was the woman doing? Do you agree or do you disagree with Charlotte? So pay close attention when you're answering that third question, guys, because that has 3 questions in it that you need to be able to answer in your response. It asks, why was she brave? Or who is the person? Why is she brave? What's the woman doing? Do you agree with this or disagree with this? So pay close attention, y'all. Here we go. Chapter 7. In chapter 6, we ended with Mr. Milshark happening to ride on Charlotte's stagecoach. But remember, she's Charlie. So Mr. Milshark didn't know, but Charlotte played a little prank on Mr. Milshark. She asked him to get out and help move the stagecoach through the mud. And then she took his boots. And she ended up giving them to Ebenezer, which was really nice and kind. And it was kind of her way to get back at Mr. Milshark for how ugly he is behind the person who he was pretending to be. Okay, here we go, chapter 7. 2 of Ebenezer's stable boys, James Birch and Frank Stevens, had left Rhode Island to come some years ago for California. Now they were back and excited as 2 puppy dogs about their adventures. They were full of stories about Argonauts and gold diggers, and Charlotte couldn't get enough of their tales. The West was wild and untamed, prospectors flocking to pan for gold up and down the lower Sierras were becoming millionaires overnight. And Sacramento. Everyone was talking about Sacramento, California, the most important river port in the West. It was a boom town, and for a businessman, it was as tempting as a candy store because if a man struck it rich, he had to have some place to take all the gold and some place to spend his worth. People got to get from one place to another, said James, so we started a small stage line, but now we're joining with other lines to start California Stage Company, and we need good drivers. We need men in the mother lode where all the gold is, where they're mining. And we're planning to expand our routes up and down the Pacific coast, so you'd have your pick. Won't you come, Charlie? The money was good and there was plenty of work for the men. The money was good and there was plenty of work for men that would go. But that interested Charlotte most was when they talked about the land. If you're looking to own any, it's cheap and plentiful, said Frank. Charlotte couldn't help but get excited. James persisted. We've secured boat passages from Atlanta to Panama. You would travel overland by mule through Panama, then secure a ship to San Francisco, and then take a riverboat to Sacramento. It's a month's journey. But when you get there, there's land as far as the eye can see, just waiting to be bought by you, Charlie. Their enthusiasm was catching. Well, boys, that land sounds mighty appealing, said Charlotte. Come on, Charlie, you're the best driver we know, and we need you, said James. Charlotte knew from the minute that they started talking about the land that she would go, but she had to tell Ebenezer, and it would not be easy. It ain't a pony ride out there in California, Ebenezer practically shouted. In some places, there ain't roads, just worn-down trails made by pack mules that went before you. The ground is filled with clunk holes, and you'll be knee-deep in dust. Yes, sir, but I need to go, said Charlotte. You don't know what you're in for. Most of the horses are just wild mustangs they bought from the foothills that you don't know how to work in their traces. You'll only make 3 miles an hour on a good day." He paced back and forth. "I hear the coaches are loaded with folks heading to mining towns and that they have to put passengers on the roof. You'll lose them off the top. And you got other things to consider. California ain't no place for you." Ebenezer had never once said anything about Charlotte's secret. He never confronted her. He never asked her outright, but he knew. He rubbed his hands over his bald head. Charlotte tried to explain. "I aim to get me a ranch, and I won't ever be able to afford it out here in the East," she said. "The West is where the land's to be had. Cheap. I don't want to spend the rest of my life sleeping in a loft. I want to get me a place, my own place, a home." He stopped pacing, crossed his arms, and said, "What about Indians? You thought about that? And carrying all that bullion? Why, a robber'll look at you and think that you're a plum, ripe for picking." Charlotte didn't answer him. She knew where he was going, and so he did. Ebenezer sat down and he looked defeated. "You're my best driver. I know I never said anything, but, well, you remind me of somebody. And it's just done my heart real good to see you outdo all of them other drivers, all of them other boys." His voice drifted off. "I had a child once, a girl, and she died from a fever the same as my wife. But that little girl, she could ride like the wind, and I ain't never seen anything like it, except you." He was quiet, and Charlotte walked over and took his hand. "I guess I put more stock in having you around than I should," he said. "I just hate to lose you to California." Charlotte didn't want to lose Ebenezer either. He had been good to her. He let her make her own way. He had protected her like a daughter. "I just bet when I get my place you could come out and stay a livery," said Charlotte. "You heard them boys talking. Sounds pretty exciting, don't it?" His eyes kind of perked up a little at the prospect. "And I'll need you out here," she said. "I aim to get a bit of land. Why, I can't run a big place all by myself." "I guess I could think about it," said Ebenezer. "Down the line. I guess I'm not too old to travel. Maybe someday." They looked at each other, and he half smiled. "Well, get along and go pack your things. I told you a long time ago that working for me would be temporary. Don't you get hammered out there, and you need anything, you holler." By now Charlotte understood his blustery ways. "Thank you," she said. "What's your name, anyways?" he grumbled. She smiled and bent over and whispered it in his ear. Charlotte stood up on the top deck of the Wilson G. Hunt, a palace of a steamboat, while it trudged up the Sacramento River. She had been traveling for 4 weeks and a day, and she was anxious to reach Sacramento. She felt like she did that day on the stagecoach when she had run away from the orphanage. Like she was on the verge of something exciting, something new. Like she was closer to realizing her dream. The Delta sprawled in front of her. It was a damp green blanket met by gentle hills. Rivolts of water shimmered through the delta. Over the hills there was land to be stretched out forever. Speckled with a few trees and brush, it was just like Frank and James had said, plenty of wide open space just waiting for her. As soon as she had enough money, she was going to buy her own property and her own place, and then she would write Ebenezer and Hayward and ask them to come too. When the boat docked in Sacramento, the port was a mass of confusion. Stagecoaches crowded the street next to the docks, waiting for passengers. Armed marshals guarded strong box filled with gold dust, waiting for the outboat to San Francisco. Porters cursed and swore and tossed parcels on the deck while the dock handlers loaded the baggage onto the coaches. James said he'd meet the boat, but Charlotte didn't know how she'd ever find him. Charlotte shoved her way through the crowd. Horses whined and pranced impatiently. Passengers disembarked around her and crowded into the streets like an army of ants at a panic. Charlotte had never seen such confusion in her life. She was jolted one way and then another. She kept on looking for James. There were so many people. "Charlie! Charlie, over here!" Relieved, she spotted James trolling an extra horse. "James, I don't know who I'm gladder to see, you or that horse." "Climb on, Charlie. Let's ride out of this mess. Charlotte hadn't been on a horse in some weeks, and it felt good to be riding again, and especially above the crowd. She moved the stallion through the hustle of the docks and followed James toward the outskirts of town. But as quickly as they got away from the docks, they rode into another crowded street with laughing, jeering men. A woman stood on the steps of the saloon, passing out handbills to anyone who would take them. Wyoming Territory is already talking about giving women the right to vote, she called out. If Wyoming can recognize a woman's rightful voice, then California should too. Then let the women move to Wyoming, yelled a man in the crowd. With the men out in the mines, many women are running the farms and should be able to make decisions that affect their properties and their families. Women have already organized in the East and have already held a women's rights convention, she yelled back. Stick with cooking and babies, yelled another man, and a group let out a whoop of laughter. Most dropped handbills on the ground and went inside. The others shook their heads and walked away. The women folk hurried about their business, and many did not stop or look up, but Charlotte noticed a few of them picking up the handbills and tucking them into their pockets. Charlotte got off the horse and headed toward the saloon steps. Charlie, what are you up to? Hollered James. She approached the woman. I'd like one of them handbills, said Charlotte. The women looked at Charlotte and handed over one of the papers. Are you prepared to laugh also? She asked. No, ma'am, said Charlotte. I would be interested to know who you would vote for in the upcoming political race. The woman studied Charlotte's face for a mockery. Charlotte said again, if you could vote, who would you vote for? While Charlotte listened, the woman explained her views on the candidates. She also told her about the convention in Sienna Falls, New York, and when the women and men who gathered there in the name of women's rights. When she had finished, the woman said, You know, there are men who support our movement too, young men. I agree with them men, said Charlotte, as she reached out and shook the woman's hand. Then Charlotte tipped her hat and said, You are much braver than me. She got back on the horse and she left a surprised woman standing on the saloon steps. As she rode along, she read the handbill. She was familiar with politics. Stage drivers heard all the news from the passengers, and Charlotte had opinions of her own. She meant it when she told the woman that she was brave. It took courage to stand up in front of all of those laughing men. Charlotte wished that she could have done something more for the lady. You sympathizing with her? Asked James. It's interesting and all, said Charlotte. You're going to find a lot of interesting things here, things we ain't never seen in the East. But right now, let's get you settled. A few miles later, out of Sacramento, James and Frank had covered the ramshackle building into a coach barn and stables. Outside, an impressive sign said California Stage Company. Inside Concord, stagecoaches, the finest from the East, were lined up waiting for the stage drivers until the next runs. There was a bunkhouse for the handles, but since there wasn't a loft, Charlotte found a storeroom off the tack room that suited her fine. Everything's a bit makeshift, Charlie, said James. We aim to get things fixed up, but we got so much business we ain't really had time. Everybody's in a hurry to get in and out of gold country, and time is money. How many drivers you got? And where are the horses? Asked Charlotte. We're starting with 10 stage whips at this stable, and already that ain't enough. But we're only taking good drivers. And the horses, well, that's another thing we're making do with. I already bought a number of bloodshed stock coursers from Australia and paid a small fortune for a particular strong stallion. I'm going to make this a reputable line with quality service, but the horses haven't arrived yet. We rounded up some of the Mustangs. They'll need to be shoed first thing in the morning. You ready to meet some of the western horses? Tame or otherwise? Asked Charlotte. James laughed. Welcome to California, Charlie. Here, everything is wild. And real quick before our time runs out, I wanted to show you the illustration of Charlie talking to the woman who is, this is like a paper ballot that's, I'm not good at this camera thing. Anyways, it's showing her the who to vote for. And remember, women did not have the right to vote at this time. So imagine the courage that it took for that woman to step foot on the stoops. All right, guys, see you on the next video.